The biting Wyoming wind howled a mournful tune, whipping snow into a frenzy that blurred the line between earth and sky. Abigail, her breath catching in her throat like a fragile bird, wasn't just lost in a blizzard. She was a ghost in her own life. A life meticulously planned by a father she barely knew. A life that would see her wed to a man whose name was as foreign as the icy landscape around her. They called it a union, a merging of cattle empires. She called it a sentence. But as the world faded to white and her strength waned, a different fate found her. A shadow in the storm, a Lakota warrior, his eyes as fierce and untamed as the wilderness itself. He wasn't the man she was meant to marry, but he would be the one to decide if she lived or died. The train ride from Boston had been a blur of soot-stained windows and the relentless clatter of wheels on iron tracks. Abigail clutched the worn, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick in her lap, its familiar weight a small anchor in the churning sea of her uncertainty. She was 20 years old and had never traveled farther west than Philadelphia. Now she was hurtling towards Wyoming territory, a place that existed in her mind only as a vast, untamed wilderness, a canvas for dime novel fantasies of cowboys and savages. Her father, a man she knew more through stiffly worded letters and quarterly bank drafts than through any real paternal affection, had summoned her. After a decade in a prestigious East Coast boarding school, her education was deemed complete. It was time his letter had declared in his precise, unforgiving script for her to fulfill her duty. That duty had a name, Mr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a cattle baron, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth and power in the burgeoning territory. Their marriage was a business merger, a cold calculus of assets and influence. Abigail's dowry, a substantial sum from her late mother's inheritance, would be absorbed into Finch's empire, and in return, her father's smaller but strategically located ranch would be secured. Abigail, the living, breathing embodiment of the deal, was merely a commodity to be traded. She had seen a photograph of Alistair Finch, a daguerreotype that showed a man in his late 40s with a stern, unsmiling face, a thick moustache that failed to conceal a cruel set of lips and eyes that seemed to pierce right through the viewer with an unnerving intensity. He looked like a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted, a man who would not tolerate dissent. The final leg of her journey was to be by stagecoach, a bone-jarring ride from Cheyenne to the remote outpost of Fort Laramie. It was there, amidst the uniformed soldiers and grizzled fur trappers, that she was to be met by her fiancé. The stagecoach was a cramped, airless box on wheels, shared with a motley crew of fellow travelers, a garrulous salesman of patent medicines, a silent, grim-faced man with a rifle across his lap, and a young woman with a baby who cried incessantly. Abigail, in her fine wool traveling dress and kid leather gloves, felt utterly out of place, a delicate porcelain doll in a dusty, rough-hewn world. As the stagecoach rumbled on, the landscape outside transformed from the rolling plains of Nebraska to the stark, dramatic beauty of Wyoming. The sky was a vast, endless dome of brilliant blue, and the air, when she dared to crack open the window, was crisp and clean, with the scent of pine and sage. For a fleeting moment, a sense of wonder, of adventure, flickered within her. Perhaps this new life, this wild, untamed land, held a different kind of freedom, a freedom she had never known in the suffocating drawing rooms of Boston society. But the fantasy was short-lived. The weather, with the fickle temperament of a scorned lover, began to turn. The brilliant blue sky was swallowed by a leaden grey, and the gentle breeze sharpened into a biting wind that rattled the stagecoach and sent shivers down Abigail's spine. The first snowflakes, fat and wet, splattered against the window pane, and soon the world outside was a swirling vortex of white. The salesman who had been regaling them with tales of his miraculous elixir of life fell silent. The grim-faced man peered out the window, his expression growing even more severe. The baby, as if sensing the rising tension, began to wail with renewed vigor. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled old-timer named Jed, pulled the horses to a halt. "Blizzard's settin' in fierce," he yelled over the howling wind. "We'll have to try and make it to a way station. It ain't far. But in this whiteout, it might as well be the moon." The stagecoach lurched forward, battling against the wind and the rapidly accumulating snow. The world outside was a formless, shifting landscape of white. Abigail could feel the cold seeping into the carriage, a damp, bone-chilling cold that her fine wool dress was no match for. The baby's cries had subsided to a pitiful whimper, and its mother rocked it back and forth, her face a mask of fear. Hours passed, each one an eternity. The stagecoach, which had been crawling along at a snail's pace, finally shuddered to a halt. Jed's face caked in snow, and his mustache frozen solid, threw open the door. "This is as far as we go," he announced, his voice grim. "The axle's broke. We'll have to make a run for it." Abigail's heart plummeted. Make a run for it. In this blinding, raging blizzard, it was a death sentence. But there was no other choice. One by one, they clambered out of the stagecoach into the maelstrom. The wind tore at Abigail's clothes, and the snow, driven with relentless force, stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The world was a swirling chaos of white. Jed, trying to be the voice of reason in the panic, shouted, "Stay close. Follow me. The way station is just over that rise." But what rise? In the disorienting whiteness, there were no landmarks, no sense of direction. They stumbled forward, a desperate, huddled group, their hopes pinned on the old-timer's sense of direction. But the blizzard was a merciless, impartial killer. It did not care for their plans, their hopes, their fears. One by one, they became separated. A sudden, violent gust of wind sent Abigail stumbling, and when she regained her footing, the others were gone, swallowed by the whiteout. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She called out, her voice a feeble cry against the roar of the wind. "Hello, Jed. Is anyone there?" Only the howling of the wind answered her. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, in the heart of a Wyoming blizzard. The cold was beginning to numb her limbs, and a dangerous lethargy was creeping over her. She knew with a dreadful certainty that if she stopped moving, if she succumbed to the seductive whisper of sleep, she would never wake up. She stumbled on her legs, heavy as lead, her mind a fog of fear and despair. The image of Alistair Finch's cold, cruel face flashed in her mind. She had been on her way to marry a stranger, and now she would die a stranger in this desolate, frozen wasteland. It was a cruel, ironic twist of fate. She had railed against the life that had been chosen for her, and now she would give anything to have it back, to be safe and warm, even if it meant a loveless marriage. Her strength was failing. Her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the deep snow. The copy of Moby Dick, which she had clutched so tightly, slipped from her numb fingers and was instantly buried in the snow. So this was it. This was how her story ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, freezing fade into oblivion. As her eyelids grew heavy and the world began to fade to black, she saw a shadow emerge from the swirling snow. a tall, imposing figure on horseback, a silhouette against the white. For a moment she thought she was hallucinating, that the cold was playing tricks on her mind. But the figure grew closer, more distinct. It was a man, his face framed by long black hair, his eyes dark and intense. He was wrapped in a buffalo robe, and he carried a rifle in the crook of his arm. He was not a white man. He was an Indian, a Lakota warrior, his presence as wild and untamed as the storm itself. He dismounted and approached her, his moccasins making no sound in the deep snow. He knelt before her, and his dark eyes, which she had at first thought fierce, now held a flicker of something else. Compassion. Pity. He reached out a gloved hand and gently brushed the snow from her face. His touch, surprisingly gentle, sent a jolt of warmth through her frozen body. He spoke, his voice low and resonant, the words foreign to her ears, yet somehow she understood their meaning. He was asking her a question that hung in the frozen air between them, a question that would change the course of her life forever. He was not the man she was meant to marry, but in that moment, as she teetered on the brink of death, he was her only hope. The Lakota warrior's name was Wanikiyewin, which meant savior in his language. He had been tracking a winter-starved wolf that had been preying on his people's horses when he stumbled upon the tracks of the stagecoach, and then the faint, almost completely erased footprints of a lone traveler. Curiosity and a deep-seated reverence for life had compelled him to follow. He had found Abigail on the verge of succumbing to the White Death, as his people called it. He had seen it many times before, the way the cold crept into a person's soul and stole their will to live. He worked quickly, his movements economical and precise. He wrapped her in a thick buffalo robe, lifted her onto his horse, and mounted behind her, his body a shield against the biting wind. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a confusing jumble of sensations, the rhythmic sway of the horse, the warmth of the buffalo robe, the solid presence of the man behind her, the low, guttural sounds of his voice as he spoke to his horse in the Lakota tongue. She had been raised on stories of savages, of wild, bloodthirsty Indians who were a menace to civilized folk. And yet this man, this savage, was her savior. He had found her when all hope was lost, and he was treating her with a gentleness that belied his fierce appearance. After what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at his winter camp. It was not the sprawling village of teepees that Abigail had imagined from the lurid illustrations in dime novels. It was a small, sheltered encampment in a grove of cottonwood trees with a handful of lodges made of animal hides and wood. Smoke curled from the tops of the lodges, a welcome sign of warmth and life in the frozen landscape. Wanikiyewin carried her into his lodge and laid her gently on a bed of soft furs. A fire pit in the center of the lodge cast a warm, flickering glow on the interior, revealing walls adorned with painted symbols and a collection of weapons and tools. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and something else, something wild and earthy that Abigail couldn't quite identify. An old woman with a face like a wrinkled apple and eyes as bright as a bird's came to her side. She spoke to Abigail in the Lakota language, her voice soft and soothing, and offered her a warm, nourishing broth. Abigail, her throat raw, and her body aching, drank it gratefully. For the next few days, Abigail hovered in a liminal space between waking and sleeping, her body slowly recovering from the ordeal of the blizzard. The old woman, whose name was Chimalis, which meant bluebird, tended to her with a gentle, practiced hand, applying poultices of herbs to her frost-bitten fingers and toes, and feeding her a steady diet of broth and stew. Abigail learned that Wanakiyewin was a respected warrior in his tribe, a man known for his courage and his skill as a hunter. He was also a widower, his wife and child having been taken by the shaking sickness, smallpox, a few years earlier. The tragedy had left a deep sadness in his eyes, a shadow that even his fierce demeanor could not completely conceal. As her strength returned, Abigail began to take in her surroundings with a growing sense of wonder. The Lakota people, far from being the savages of her imagination, were a proud, resilient people with a rich and complex culture. She watched them as they went about their daily lives, their movements graceful and purposeful, their voices filled with a language that was as musical as it was foreign. She learned about their deep spiritual connection to the land, their reverence for the buffalo, and their belief in Wakantanka, the Great Spirit. She saw the intricate beadwork on their clothing, the beautiful quillwork on their moccasins, and the powerful symbols painted on their lodges. Wanakiyewin, though a man of few words, began to open up to her. He would sit by the fire in the evenings and tell her stories of his people, of their history, their heroes and their struggles. He spoke of the Wasikus, the white people who were encroaching on their lands, breaking their treaties, and slaughtering the buffalo, the lifeblood of the Lakota people. His words were filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a fierce determination to protect his way of life. Abigail, who had always seen the westward expansion of the United States as a glorious, inevitable march of progress, began to see it from a different perspective. She saw the human cost of that progress, the displacement and suffering of a people who had lived on this land for generations. A strange and unexpected bond began to form between them, a bond forged in the crucible of the blizzard and nurtured by the shared intimacy of the winter lodge. Abigail found herself drawn to Wanakiyewin's quiet strength, his deep-seated integrity, and the sadness that lingered in his eyes. He, in turn, seemed to see beyond her fine clothes and her East Coast accent to the curious and compassionate woman beneath. But their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a visitor. A white man, a fur trapper named Silas Croft, who was known to the Lakota as a man who could be trusted. He brought news from the outside world, news that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. Alistair Finch, her fiancé, had not been idle. He had organized a search party, offering a substantial reward for any information about the missing stagecoach and its passengers. His name was on everyone's lips, his influence felt even in this remote corner of Wyoming. The news was a stark reminder of the world that Abigail had left behind, the world that was waiting for her, whether she wanted it or not. She was a woman betrothed, a piece of property in a business transaction. Her brief sojourn in the Lakota camp was nothing more than a temporary reprieve, a fleeting dream from which she was about to be rudely awakened. That night, as the wind howled outside the lodge, a new kind of storm raged within Abigail's heart. She was torn between two worlds, two futures, two men. One was a man she was supposed to marry, a man who represented wealth, security, and a life of stifling conformity. The other was a man who had saved her life, a man who had shown her a different way of being, a man who had awakened something in her that she never knew existed. She looked at Wanakiyewin, who was staring into the fire, his face a mask of stoic impassivity. But she could see the turmoil in his eyes, the reflection of the storm that was raging in her own soul. She knew that she had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the man who had found her in the snow. And she knew with a sinking heart that whatever she chose there would be a price to pay. The shadow of the Black Hills, the sacred land of the Lakota, had fallen over her life, and she knew that she would never be the same again. The news of Alistair Finch's search party cast a long, dark shadow over the winter camp. The fragile peace that Abigail had found in the sheltered grove of cottonwood trees was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The outside world, with its relentless demands and its cold, hard bargains, had found her. Wanakeyewin, too, was on edge. He knew the ways of the Wasikus, their insatiable greed, their disregard for the promises they made. He had seen their soldiers, their forts, their iron horses that scarred the sacred earth. He knew that a man like Alistair Finch, a man of power and influence, would not be easily deterred. A council was held among the elders of the tribe. The news of the white woman's presence in their camp was a dangerous complication. Some argued that she should be returned to her own people immediately. Her presence, they feared, would bring nothing but trouble, the kind of trouble that came with soldiers and guns and broken treaties. Others, however, spoke of the sacred duty of hospitality, of the compassion that Wakan Tanka demanded of them. The woman had come to them as a supplicant, a victim of the storm. To turn her away now, especially with the reward hanging over her head, would be a betrayal of their values. Wanakeyewin, his voice, low and steady, spoke in her defense. He told the story of how he had found her, a frozen bird on the verge of death. He spoke of her courage, her curiosity, her willingness to learn their ways. He argued that she was not like the other Wasikus, the ones who saw the land and its people as something to be conquered and exploited. In the end, it was Chimalis, the old woman with the bird-bright eyes, who swayed the council. "The Great Spirit works in mysterious ways," she said, her voice raspy with age. "The storm brought this woman to us for a reason. We must not be so quick to question the path that has been laid before us." And so it was decided. Abigail would remain in the camp under Wanakeyewin's protection until a decision could be made about her future. But the future, it seemed, had a way of arriving unannounced. A few days later, a lone rider approached the camp. It was not a fur trapper or a friendly visitor. It was a man in a dusty suit and a bowler hat, his face red and wind-burned, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He was one of Finch's men, a hired gun, with a reputation for ruthlessness. He had followed the tracks of Wanakeyewin's horse, his instincts telling him that the Lakota warrior might have some knowledge of the missing woman. Wanakeyewin met him at the edge of the camp, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. The man, whose name was Cole, dismounted, his eyes darting around the camp, taking in the lodges, the women, the children. "I'm looking for a woman," Cole said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "A white woman. Came in on the Cheyenne stagecoach. She's to be married to Mr. Alistair Finch." Wanakeyewin's face was a mask of impassivity. "I have seen no white woman," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Cole's eyes narrowed. He knew the Indian was lying. He could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Mr. Finch is offering a handsome reward," Cole said, his voice laced with a predatory purr. $1,000 in gold. That's a lot of money for a simple Indian." The insult hung in the air between them, a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. Wanakeyewin's hand tightened on his knife, but he did not move. He knew that violence would only bring more violence, that it would endanger not only Abigail, but his entire people. "Your gold is of no use to me," Wanakeyewin said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. "Go back to your Wasichu chief and tell him that his woman is not here." Cole sneered, a flash of yellow teeth in his sun-beaten face. "I don't think so," he said. "I think I'll have a look around for myself." He started to push past Wanakeyewin, But the Lakota warrior moved with a speed that belied his size, blocking his path. For a long moment, the two men stood face to face, locked in a silent battle of wills. The tension was a palpable thing, a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Just then Abigail, who had been watching from the entrance of her lodge, her heart pounding in her chest, stepped out into the open. "I am here," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her insides were churning with fear. Cole's eyes widened in surprise, and then a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Well, well, well," he said. "Look what the cat dragged in. The blushing bride herself." He turned to Wanakiyewin, his smile turning into a sneer. "So the noble savage was lying after all. I should have known." Abigail's heart went out to Wanakiyewin. He had lied to protect her, to protect his people. And now she had exposed him. "He was only trying to help me," she said, her voice pleading. "I was lost in the blizzard. He saved my life." Cole chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Saved your life, did he? Or was he planning on keeping you for himself? A pretty little white squaw to warm his bed at night." The words were a slap in the face, a crude, vulgar insinuation that made Abigail's blood boil. But before she could respond, Wanakiyewin spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You will show the woman respect," he said, his hand still on his knife. Cole, for the first time, seemed to sense that he had pushed too far. He was a ruthless man, but he was not a foolish one. He was outnumbered, and the Lakota warrior before him was not a man to be trifled with. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right, he said. "No need to get your feathers ruffled. I'll take the woman and be on my way. Mr. Finch will be very pleased." He reached for Abigail's arm, but she pulled away, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I am not a piece of property to be bought and sold," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Cole's face darkened. "You are what Mr. Finch says you are," he said, his voice taking on a hard, menacing edge. "And right now you are his fiancée, and you are coming with me." He lunged for her, but Wanakiyewin was faster. He moved between them, a human shield. His body tense and coiled like a snake, ready to strike. "The woman will decide for herself," Wanakiyewin said, his voice a low growl. Cole, realizing that he was not going to get what he wanted, through force, changed his tactics. He turned to Abigail, his voice now smooth and persuasive. "Look, miss," he said, "I understand you've been through a terrible ordeal. But you have to be reasonable. Mr. Finch is a powerful man. He's not a man you want to cross. He can make things very difficult for you for these people." He gestured to the Lakota camp, to the women and children who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "You don't want to bring trouble down on them, do you? All you have to do is come with me. You'll be safe, you'll be comfortable, you'll have a life of luxury. What more could you want?" His words were a poisoned arrow aimed at the heart of Abigail's conscience. He was right. Her defiance, her refusal to go with him, could have devastating consequences for the people who had shown her nothing but kindness. She was trapped between her desire for freedom and her sense of responsibility, trapped between the man who had saved her life and the man who held her future in his hands. She looked at Wanakiyewin, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. She saw the anger, the pride, the fierce protectiveness, but she also saw the sadness, the resignation, the knowledge that he could not fight this battle for her. It was her choice, her sacrifice to make. She took a deep breath, her heart heavy as a stone. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll go with you." The words were a surrender, a betrayal of everything she had come to feel in this wild, untamed land. But she saw no other way. Cole's face broke into a triumphant grin. He had won. He had gotten what he came for. He turned to Wanakiyewin, his eyes glinting with malice. "You see," he said, "in the end, they always choose their own kind." He grabbed Abigail's arm, his grip hard and bruising, and pulled her towards his horse. She did not resist. She was numb, her mind a fog of despair. As she was about to be hoisted onto the horse, she looked back at Wanakiyewin one last time. Their eyes met, and in that moment she saw a universe of unspoken emotions, regret, sorrow, and a flicker of something that looked like love. And then she was gone, riding away from the only place she had ever felt truly alive, back to a life that was a gilded cage, a loveless marriage, a deal with the devil. The snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent flakes that covered the tracks of Cole's horse, erasing the evidence of her brief, impossible dream. The shadow of the Black Hills receded in the distance, and Abigail knew with a chilling certainty that she was leaving a part of her soul behind in that frozen, beautiful land. The journey to Alistair Finch's ranch was a silent, somber affair. Cole, having secured his prize, was a man of few words. His attention focused on the trail ahead. Abigail, wrapped in a thick wool blanket he had grudgingly provided, was lost in her own thoughts, her mind a whirlwind of regret and resignation. The landscape, which had seemed so beautiful and awe-inspiring from the vantage point of Wanakiyewin's horse, now seemed harsh and unforgiving, a reflection of the desolation in her own heart. The snow-covered plains stretched on endlessly, a vast white canvas of emptiness. After a day and a half of hard riding, they arrived at the Double F Ranch, the sprawling empire of Alistair Finch. It was a testament to his wealth and power, a self-contained kingdom in the heart of Wyoming. A massive two-story ranch house built of sturdy timber and stone stood at the center of a complex of barns, stables and bunkhouses. A small army of cowboys and ranch hands moved about with a sense of purpose, their loyalty to their employer unquestionable. Finch himself was waiting for them on the porch of the main house. He was just as he had appeared in the daguerreotype, tall, imposing with a stern, unsmiling face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn attire of his men. He looked at Abigail, his eyes raking over her disheveled appearance, her borrowed Lakota moccasins, her face pale and drawn. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a possessive smile. "Abigail," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that held a note of ownership. "I was beginning to worry about you." He did not ask her if she was all right, if she was hurt, if she was frightened. He was not concerned with her well-being, only with the fact that his property had been returned to him. He dismissed Cole with a curt nod and a pouch of gold, and then turned his attention back to Abigail. "You must be exhausted," he said, his voice softening into a semblance of concern. "I have a room prepared for you. You will want to rest and make yourself presentable." He led her into the house, a grand, imposing structure that was a monument to his ego. The walls were adorned with the mounted heads of buffalo elk and bare their glass eyes staring down with a lifeless, accusatory gaze. The furniture was heavy and ornate, imported from the finest workshops in the East. It was a house that was meant to impress, to intimidate, to proclaim the owner's dominance over man and nature. Abigail was shown to a large, lavishly decorated bedroom with a four-poster bed, a velvet-covered chaise lounge, and a wardrobe filled with expensive dresses, all in her size. It was a gilded cage, a beautiful prison designed to her exact specifications. A young Irish maid named Bridie was assigned to her, a timid, wide-eyed girl who seemed to be terrified of her own shadow. She helped Abigail bathe and dress her movements quick and nervous, her eyes darting to the door as if she expected Finch to burst in at any moment. That evening, Abigail was expected to join Finch for dinner. She chose a simple, high-necked dress of dark blue velvet, a color that matched the sorrow in her heart. She wore her hair in a severe chignon, her face pale and unadorned. She was a ghost at the feast, a silent, beautiful automaton, going through the motions of a life that was not her own. Finch, on the other hand, was in a celebratory mood. He had opened a bottle of his finest French wine and was regaling her with tales of his business ventures, his triumphs over his rivals, his plans for the future. He spoke of her as if she were his most prized acquisition, a beautiful, well-bred mare that would produce strong, healthy heirs to his empire. He did not ask her about her time in the Lakota camp. He did not want to hear about her ordeal about the man who had saved her life. He wanted to erase that part of her story, to pretend that it had never happened. But Abigail could not forget. She could not forget the warmth of Wanakiyewin's lodge, the kindness of Chimalis, the sound of the Lakota language, the feeling of Wanakiyewin's hand in hers. The memories were a constant aching presence, a reminder of the life she had been forced to leave behind. Days turned into weeks, and Abigail settled into a numb, listless routine. She would wake up in her gilded cage, be dressed and groomed by her timid maid, and then spend her days reading sewing or staring out the window at the vast, empty landscape. She was a prisoner in her own home, a beautiful decorative object, with no purpose other than to please her future husband. Finch, for his part, seemed to be content with their arrangement. He was not a man who required conversation or companionship. He required obedience, and Abigail, in her silent, passive resistance, gave him that. He would come to her in the evenings, his breath smelling of whiskey and cigars, and talk at her, his voice a low, self-satisfied drone. He would sometimes touch her, his hands cold and possessive, and she would flinch, her body recoiling from his unwanted advances. She lived in a state of constant low-grade fear. She was afraid of Finch, of his temper, of his moods, of the violence that she sensed simmering just beneath the surface of his calm, controlled exterior. She was afraid of the future of the wedding day that was drawing ever closer, of the life that stretched before her, a long, bleak and empty road. One day, a new ranch hand arrived at the Double F. He was a quiet, sullen man, with a scarred face and a mean-looking disposition. Abigail paid him no mind until she overheard a conversation between two of the cowboys. They were talking about the new man, about his past, about the things he had done. His name, they said, was Cole. Abigail's blood ran cold. It was him, the man who had dragged her away from Wanakiyewin, the man who had sneered at the Lakota warrior and called her a squaw. She confronted Finch that evening, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Why is he here?" she demanded. "That man, Cole. Why did you hire him?" Finch looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. "He's a good man to have around," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "He knows how to handle trouble." "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Finch smiled a cruel, humorless smile. "The kind of trouble that comes from Indians who don't know their place," he said. the kind of trouble that comes from women who forget who they belong to. The threat was clear, the message unmistakable. Cole was here as a warning, a reminder of Finch's power, a symbol of the fate that awaited anyone who dared to defy him. That night, Abigail lay in her bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a hostage, and the man who held her captive was a monster. She thought of Wanakiyewin, of his courage, his integrity, his fierce protectiveness. She thought of the life she could have had with him, a life of hardship, perhaps, but also a life of freedom, of love, of belonging. And in the darkness of her gilded cage, a small, defiant flame of hope was kindled. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn in Finch's game. She would find a way to escape, a way to get back to the man who had found her in the snow, the man who held her heart in his hands. The decision was made. The die was cast. The only question now was how. The presence of Cole on the Double F ranch was a malignancy. A constant throbbing reminder of the cage that enclosed Abigail. He was more than a guard. He was a spectre of Finch's possessiveness, a walking embodiment of the casual cruelty that underpinned this entire empire. She would see him lounging near the stables, his scarred face a permanent sneer, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory familiarity that made her skin crawl. He never spoke to her directly after that first day, but his silent, watchful presence was a constant violation, a promise of violence held in reserve. But fear, Abigail was learning, was a double-edged sword. It could be a paralytic, a poison that seeped into the bones and stole the will, or it could be a whetstone sharpening the mind and honing the spirit to a razor's edge. Trapped within the opulent walls of her prison, watching the vast, indifferent Wyoming sky, Abigail chose to be honed. The passive resistance of her early days was no longer enough. The quiet sorrow had to curdle into active rebellion. She would not simply endure. She would escape. The thought, once it took root, was terrifying in its audacity. Escape to where? To what? The wilderness that had nearly claimed her once, and how? The ranch was a fortress teeming with men whose loyalty was bought and paid for by the man she sought to flee. She was one woman, a stranger in this land with no resources and no allies. Or perhaps she had one. Her gaze fell upon Bridie, the timid Irish maid, with eyes as wide and startled as a fawn's. The girl was a ghost in the house, flitting through rooms with downcast eyes and whispered apologies, her every movement dictated by a mortal fear of Alistair Finch. Yet beneath that terror, Abigail sensed a current of deep, untapped empathy. She saw it in the way Bridie's hands would gently linger when arranging her hair, in the fleeting looks of pity she would cast when she thought Abigail wasn't looking. Abigail began to cultivate this fragile seed of an alliance, not with a sudden confession, but with the slow, patient care of a gardener. She started by asking Bridie about her home, about the green hills of County Cork she had left behind. She listened, truly listened, as Bridie spoke of her family, her voice thick with a homesickness that Abigail understood all too well. They were both exiles adrift in this harsh foreign land, albeit in vastly different circumstances. One evening, as Bridie was turning down the bed, Abigail took a breath and spoke of Boston, of a life that felt as distant as a star. She didn't speak of Wanakiyewin, not yet. She spoke only of the coldness of a life arranged, of the suffocating weight of duty. He looks at me as if I'm one of his prize mares, Abigail said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Something he's purchased to improve his stock." Bridie froze, her hands stilling on the velvet comforter. She glanced nervously at the closed door, her body tense. "You mustn't say such things, Miss," she whispered, her Irish lilt thick with alarm. "The master. He has ears everywhere. And you, Bridie." Abigail pressed her eyes, searching the maid's face. "Are you happy here? Do you feel free?" A single tear traced a path down Bridie's pale cheek. "Freedom is a luxury for the rich, miss," she murmured, a world of sorrow in her simple words. "For the likes of me, there's only service." That was the opening Abigail had been waiting for. Over the next few days, the story tumbled out in hushed tones, in the quiet moments when they were alone. She told Bridie everything: the blizzard, the broken stagecoach, the shadow in the snow who had saved her. She spoke of the Lakota camp, of Chimalis's gentle hands, and of Wanaki Yewin's quiet strength. She painted a picture of a life that was hard and uncertain, but real and vibrant, a life where she was not a possession, but a person. Bridie listened, her initial fear giving way to wide-eyed wonder. Raised on tales of folklore and epic romance, she saw Abigail's story not as a scandalous affair with a savage, but as a grand, tragic love story. Her fear of Finch didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective loyalty to the woman who had confided in her. The tyrant of the Double F became the villain of their shared narrative, and Bridie, the timid maid, cast herself in the role of a co-conspirator. "We have to get you away from him," Bridie declared one night, her voice filled with a newfound resolve that startled them both. "We have to." Their whispered conversations turned to plotting. Bridie, with her near invisibility within the household, became Abigail's eyes and ears. She learned the routines of the ranch hands, the schedule of the patrols, the weaknesses in the fortress. It was Bridie who discovered that Finch, consumed by a new land acquisition deal, was planning a 4-day trip to Cheyenne to meet with railroad investors. It was the opening. They needed a precious window of opportunity. But the window was useless if they couldn't get a message to the world outside. The Lakota camp was days away, across a wilderness that was both vast and perilous. They needed a messenger, a rider who knew the land and could be trusted to face its dangers. Once again, it was Bridie who found the answer. She had noticed the way one of the younger cowboys, a quiet, sandy-haired man named Billy, looked at her during her trips to the mess hall. He was different from the others, lacking their hardened cynicism. He had a gentle way with the horses and a copy of a well-worn poetry book tucked into his saddlebag. He also, Bridie had observed, bore a deep, unspoken resentment for Cole, who had once whipped a horse Billy favored nearly to death for a minor stumble. Bridie approached him cautiously, using her charm and his obvious affection for her as a key to unlock his trust. She didn't tell him about Wanaki Yewin. That was a truth too dangerous to share. Instead, she wove a simpler tale, a damsel in distress narrative that appealed directly to Billy's chivalrous heart. She told him that Miss Abigail was being held by Finch against her will, that he was a cruel master, and that she had family in a small settlement to the north who could protect her. The lie was a necessary sin. Billy was hesitant at first, fully aware of Finch's legendary temper and Cole's viciousness. "If Mr. Finch finds out," he began, his voice trailing off as he imagined the consequences. "And if he forces her to marry him?" Bridie countered, her eyes pleading. "To live a life of misery with a man like that, when she could be free, is that a thing? A good man can stand by and watch." She touched his arm lightly. "I thought you were a good man, Billy." That, combined with his hatred for Cole and his desire to be a hero in Bridie's eyes, was enough. He agreed. The message was a single desperate sentence scrawled by Abigail on a torn scrap of linen with a piece of charcoal from the hearth. He travels to Cheyenne. 4 days. They hold me prisoner. Help me. She signed it, not with her name, but with a small, crude drawing of a bluebird, the meaning of Chimalis's name, a symbol only Wanakiyewin would understand. The night of Finch's departure was a symphony of tension. Abigail played the part of the dutiful fiancé, allowing him to kiss her cheek, his touch as cold and dry as old parchment. She had to fight the bile that rose in her throat. As the carriage disappeared down the long ranch road, a collective unspoken sigh of relief passed between her and Bridie. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the true test of their courage. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Billy slipped from the bunkhouse. He moved like a wraith, saddling his fastest horse, his face a mask of grim determination. Abigail and Bridie watched from her darkened window as he melted into the vast black emptiness of the plains. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. Time stretched and warped, each hour an eternity of anxious waiting. Every distant shout, every hoofbeat sent a jolt of panic through Abigail. She had to force herself to eat, to speak, to maintain the facade of placid melancholy that everyone had grown accustomed to. Cole seemed to be everywhere, his presence more menacing than ever in Finch's absence. Once he stopped her in the hallway, his whiskey-sour breath washing over her. Enjoyin' the peace and quiet, missy. He'd slurred a knowing, malicious glint in his eye. Don't get too used to it. The master will be back, and he likes his things right where he left 'em. Abigail had simply stared back at him, her heart a block of ice, and walked away without a word, her feigned composure a thin, brittle shield. She and Bridie could only exchange frantic, terrified glances, their shared secret a heavy, dangerous weight. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as the sun began its slow descent painting the clouds in hues of blood and fire, a lone rider appeared on the eastern horizon. Abigail's breath caught in her chest. It was too soon for Finch. Could it be Billy? Or had he been caught? The figure drew closer, and her heart hammered against her ribs. It was not a cowboy on a ranch horse. This rider was one with his mount, a painted pony that moved with a fluid, powerful grace. The rider was tall and straight, his long black hair unbound, flowing freely in the wind. It was Wanakiyewin. He had come. He did not ride in like a charging cavalryman. He rode to a respectful distance from the main house and simply stopped a silent, potent challenge to the entire Double F ranch. He sat astride his horse, a warrior of the plains, his eyes fixed on the 2nd-story window where he knew she would be. Joy, pure and overwhelming, surged through Abigail, washing away the terror of the past days. The reunion, however, was violently interrupted. Aroused by the shouts of another ranch hand, Cole stumbled out of the bunkhouse, his face flushed with drink, a pistol held loosely in his hand. "Well, I'll be," he snarled, his voice a drunken, gravelly mess. "The buck has come back for his dough. You got a lot of nerve, Injun." Wanakiyewin's gaze remained locked on Abigail, but his body tensed, his hand moving to rest on the handle of the knife sheathed at his hip. "You ain't taken her," Cole spat, raising his pistol with a clumsy, unsteady hand. "She belongs to Mr. Finch, and what belongs to Mr. Finch, I protect." Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the large hay barn, a voice cut through the tension. "Put the gun down, Cole." It was Billy. He had returned, his face pale, but resolute, a rifle held steady in his hands. He had circled around, arriving just moments before Wanakiewin, and had taken up a strategic position. Cole swung around his drunken surprise, turning to rage. You little traitorous whelp. You're in on this." "It's over, Cole," Billy said, his voice shaking but firm. "Let them go." "I'll see you in hell first," Cole roared, and instead of aiming at Wanakiewin, he swung his pistol towards the unarmed Billy. A single shot cracked the evening air. Cole grunted a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He looked down at the dark, blossoming stain on his shirt, then crumpled to the dusty ground without another sound. For a heartbeat, there was a stunned silence. Then Abigail moved. She didn't hesitate. She flew down the stairs and out the front door, her fine dress catching on the rough porch steps. She ran across the yard, her feet clumsy in their leather shoes, and straight towards Wanakiewin. He leaned down his strong arm, circling her waist, and lifted her onto the horse behind him. As her arms wrapped around his chest, feeling the solid, living warmth of him, she knew she was finally safe. From the window, Bridie watched her face streaked with tears of relief and terror. From the barn, Billy emerged, the smoking rifle still in his hands, his expression a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. He had taken a life to save 3 others. Wanakiewin gave Billy a single solemn nod of acknowledgement, a recognition of the young man's sacrifice. Then he urged his horse forward. They rode not into a gentle sunset, but into the deepening twilight, a desperate flight towards an uncertain future. They left behind a gilded course in chaos, a dead man in the dust, and 2 unlikely heroes who had risked everything for a whisper of freedom. The unraveling was complete, and as the Double F Ranch receded into the darkness, Abigail pressed her face against Wanakiewin's back and breathed for the first time in a long time the clean, crisp air of hope. The story of Abigail and Wanakiewin did not end with their ride into the sunset. It was in many ways just the beginning. Their love was a bridge between 2 worlds, a testament to the power of the human heart to overcome prejudice and adversity. They faced many challenges, from the harsh realities of life on the frontier to the ever-present threat of the Wassikus, who sought to destroy the Lakota way of life. But their love, forged in the crucible of a Wyoming blizzard, was a bond that could not be broken. What did you think of Abigail's journey from a reluctant bride to a woman who defied convention for a chance at true love? Did Wanakiewin's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty capture your heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this tale of passion, peril, and the untamed spirit of the West resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with fellow story lovers. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic adventure from the heart of the Wild West. Your support helps us to keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.